wasn't, there is no story. So if it, let's say it was, let's give her the benefit of the doubt. But all she had was a private life and no story. Okay? So, whereas the daughter already has to say, well, I didn't go to college to catch a man. I was going to study this and I was going to do that. And I wasn't going to get married. But then I got the string, and then overnight, and then next morning I told my parents and I was engaged. So it came to the same thing, but there had to be something more said, because at that time the second generation was already in the 60s and 70s, where there was a counter discourse out there, a feminist discourse. So it was to maintain your integrity of your identity, you had to respond to that other discourse and tell your story differently. So but all of these people, generationally and gender-wise, were all also telling very formulaic stories. So the vocabulary of motive really is a formulaic way of talking. When we get to the romances, if we get there, we call those formula fiction. And what is formula fiction? You know what's going to happen, right? Because it's put together of bits and pieces. It doesn't go outside the bounds, but people talk like that too. Like, oh, how come, what do you do? How come you're here at this bar, like if you want to pick up somebody, what kind of lines? There are books to tell you what to say to people, right? But people talk like that anyway, and they kind of have to, because what do? There are so many situations where that's required. So this article shows us how people talk, and it uses courtship narratives because everybody has that, as she says in the article. If nothing else, if you're a dried up old maid, remember dried up old maids? Mm-hmm. Then you have a failed courtship narrative. So everybody has that, but if we have courtship narratives, not everybody could say, I married him and we lived happily ever after. If you have courtship narratives, you have to have divorce narratives. So if somebody would like to investigate that, you could look at the two articles here, one by the middle-class white woman, how she tells her divorce story, both what reasons she gives and how she narrates the events, and the Puerto Rican woman who emigrates to mainland and what happens to her marriage and why, and what that has to do with social class, language, male-female relationships, and how they detail these stories. And then you could interview your divorced parents afterwards and compare their stories to these stories, for example. That would be a good project. Nobody's ever done that. I mean, I've had a student go out, as I told you, catcall guys in the park, and that's pretty ballsy, right? I've had a female who went into the male toilets to look at what they wrote on the walls, right? The graffiti on the male toilets versus the female toilets. That's pretty ballsy too. But no one has taken me up on reading these divorce stories and looking at the vocabulary of motive and then interviewing their divorced mother and their divorced father and comparing their stories and comparing the stories to themselves. Any takers for that one? Okay, we'll hold your peace. And, okay, so those were the two there. Then the contrasting of it, part two, contrasting women and men in their storytelling. This article by Georgapoulou said, what were her conclusions? That already she talks about interruptions. We've seen that before, right? Who interrupts? Who tells jokes? So all those things reappear, some of which, if you were answering this question on a test, you could reuse material you actually had from the first part too. But most importantly, what she says, you remember those two charts that we did that kind of the last minutes before the end of class? And there were the questions. In men's stories, how many male characters and how many female characters? In women's stories, how many male characters and female characters? And then, more importantly, another chart, and how many of those characters are speaking, animated, right? And we find, I don't have it in front of me right now, but say men have 79% of the characters are men, but 95% are animated. And women have almost as many men, 73, but they have, say, 19% or 20-something% women speaking, but the men have 9% of women speaking. So what do we have is in the men's stories, the men are the actors, the subjects, the doers, and the women, if they're mentioned, because they are there somewhere, what are they? They end up being objects. Thank you. That's exactly it, right? Because they have no voice, they're voiceless. And so the men's stories are men's stories, the women's stories, because they still have all these men, are stories about life. And so what is the title of my section of Everyday Talk? Construction of Different Narrative Worlds. Construction of different, you can write that down, but it's also on the outline I gave you. And this is very important. This is the next thing that's very important. Even with the vocabulary of motive, we could say that, because if we go back to the Silverstein article, while most of the article is about these 3 generations of women and how they tell their stereotypical formulaic stories, that is their vocabulary of motive, at the end, remember I told you, she interviews the men of the 3 generations, and they say, and so how long were you engaged? Where did you, what month did you meet your wife? And the guy says, they hedged, male hedging. Remember they said, oh, I don't know, ask my wife, right? So again, it was different narrative worlds about courtship. It was the women who were telling the courtship stories, stereotypically, but they were telling the stories. The men were hedging, and they didn't know that, they didn't care, they didn't remember, or they said they didn't remember. When what they did say was, I saw her at that party and I said, I'm gonna get me that girl. That is that they talked about their agency, whereas no girl could say, I was at this party and I saw this guy and I said, boy, I'm going to go and do everything to make sure he marries me. That's not part of the stereotypical story, even though she may have well done that, right? And women do that all the time. Okay, so then who is talking and who becomes voiceless is the most important, creating different narrative worlds. And what is interesting is that in Section 3 and 4, now we're jumping just to sex talk of some sort. It's going to be that same thing. That the conclusion, after we look at the articles in each one, is that the way that teenage boys and teenage girls in that Crawford article deal with sex talk or sex acts and whatever, they're looking at it in a totally different way. So their discourse, and except she says that sex discourse, because it's a patriarchal world, there's a hegemonic male sex-derived discourse. So that the discourse we use to talk about sex normally is the male discourse. Think of just one word and you'll remember it. To screw. Think of to screw, right? I don't have to show you, right? It's the male word, okay? It's the penetrative act. So everything else, that's just one metaphor, but it's the penetrative act that is used, and she's going to say, and we're going to read some of the examples because is that there is no real negotiation, because for a negotiation you need 2 parties who are equal. There is a silencing again. Especially the being picked up, there's some scenes of what happens when they're picked up and how they can't negotiate. And her conclusion is a total lack of intersubjectivity. But that's really just another way of saying what we just said before, different narrative worlds, that they see what is happening and they talk about what is happening in a different way. But intersubjectivity, what does that mean? I'm a subject and you're a subject. So you're human. If there is no intersubjectivity, again, it's objectifying the other. It's no different than what we saw in catcalling before, right? That woman you are catcalling becomes the object. Or all those words for slut shaming, or all those words for women that are terrible, they all make her into an object rather than a subject. Okay, so let's look at that article then. So, okay, so Crawford, women's sex talk and men's sex talk, different worlds. It's right there in the title. So different worlds is again, no intersubjectivity, different narrative worlds, different sexual worlds, and the acceptance, like in porn movies, you have the sex act where everything happens immediately, which is in a certain kind of heterosexual porn. There's a famous one that I used to teach in another class where there's a classroom like this, although like it's supposed to be an art class, and this guy and this girl see each other in the classroom, and then everybody leaves, but they stay in the classroom. And they have hot and heavy sex about 7 times or something. And there is also a janitor on the outside who's listening, so that increases the excitement. And it describes the various ways that they do it and so forth. and it talks about her hot clitoris, because that becomes like a penis substitute, but she has no name, no hair color even, there's nothing, and there's nothing happening in between. They don't even have a conversation. It's just sex act after sex act. So that would be an extreme. So that kind of pornography would be an extreme example of male sex drive discourse. Just how many acts can you have in what kind of variation, but there's no in between. And at the end, that appeared, I think, in Penthouse, that particular story that I used to use in class. And what happens then, it's all over, and of course there's never, everybody comes 7 times, you know, the girl does too, and there is no body odors, there's no menstruation, there is, you know, no possibility of anything else, just act after act. And when it's all over, they have a good laugh and they go out for pizza. So there's also no commitment, right? So it's like what today you would call the hookup culture kind of thing. So that's what this is saying in a way. So pertaining to there is no negotiation, I'm going to just, so let's look at intersubjectivity. Page 573, how do they define it? Intersubjectivity is the space, 573, is the space within which human beings make sense of their experience. We could say it when people talk to each other, would be another way of saying it. Is the recognition of the other as a human like oneself, and that the knowledge that others recognize one in a similar way. You don't have to quote this, but it is, well, we talk to each other as equal human beings, basically. And we take into account consideration the other person's views, feelings, opinions, right? It is knowing what it is like to be female, working class, poor, member of a party, church, etc. So it's not only gender differences, so you could be talking to someone of a different social class, different race, and have no idea about how they feel about a certain thing because you have a lack of understanding. And intersubjectivity points to a sharing of meaning. So it's not enough to have this dialogue and have the other person as human, but you have to get to some understanding about something that you're going to do together, like in this class, what the paper is going to be like. We have to come to some agreement on that. Otherwise, there is no intersubjectivity. But because male discourses are hegemonic, not just about sex. Look at all those insult words we've studied. Look at everything we studied, that the language is paid. Look at something that's not sexual at all. If I say witness, and I ask you to draw a picture, 79% or 98% among kids are going to draw a male, right? Why? Are there more males? Are there more male witnesses? It's a non-gendered word. It's like the universal he. The male becomes figured. So what they're saying here in the male sex drive discourse is the same way. It's screw, 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 and let's how many times can we do it? And that is what we have a vocabulary for. So one of the problems is not only the lack of intersubjectivity, but that females do not have a vocabulary with which to express their needs and desires. And one of the views here, just to get ahead for a moment, this strange little article which came out in the New York Times right after the Aziz Ansari incident, you know, when there was the discussion of did he try to force her or was it consensual? And she writes this article that bodies rippers are the old-fashioned name for like Harlequin romances. And she says, we actually need those kind of romance novels for women, precisely because women don't have a sexual discourse, and they're supposed to be the object, and they accept that, and in this examples, in this article, we're going to see that they do. So therefore, the one thing about Harlequin romances, it's the woman, it's the female gaze, she's looking at the guy and saying, oh, he's dark, tall, dark, and handsome, or tall, dark, and athletic, and I'm going to get me that man. In those novels, she actually says that, which I just said that women don't say, and they would never say that in those courtship romances. But in the romance, of course, then there comes the scene when he almost rapes her, and she says, oh, no, no, but it was so exciting. So there are lots of problems with those romances. But one of the points that can be said in its favor, any of you want to admit to reading romances? No, I'm not going to embarrass you by that. But it's 35 to 45% of literature sold as Harlequin romances, so it's a tremendously large industry. But so what romances have, romance novels, yes, they're fantasy and all this stuff, and they're full of fancy brand names to buy. So instead of having 7 sex acts, you have a lot of shopping, and you're on a cruise ship, or you go to Paris and you meet a tall, handsome guy, or perhaps a tall, dark and handsome one, and a tall, blonde, handsome one, and you have to